Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're catching us from. Welcome to the September monthly webinar for African Liberty. As usual, we have exciting topics every month just to share with you, and also inviting experts in the field to understand matters that are affecting the continent of Africa. And today I have very exciting guests that are going to help us, or guests rather, that is going to help us understand today's very important topic that I will be introducing soon. Now, quickly, I want to mention that today's topic is what is happening right now in the country. It's actually trending. We are going to discuss about trade policy in conflict zone areas, steps of recovery. So this discussion will dive into the complexities of trade policy in conflict zones, focusing on the crucial steps required for economic recovery, which is very important. And also we'll explore how strategic trade policies can be leveraged to stabilize conflict-affected areas, rebuild economies, and foster long-term peace. And I think we have quite a number of examples that we're going to give in today's discussion. Now, quickly, I want to introduce my guest today. We were supposed to have two guests, but one of our guests is actually engaged and he's unable to actually join us today. Okay, so one of my guests this evening is Professor Bhaso Ndzendze. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Professor, but he is an associate professor of politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg. His work focuses on sovereignty, territorial disputes, technology, and trade. He's the author of the Political Economy of Sino-South African Trade and Regional Competition, which was published by Belgrave Macmillan in 2022. Professor, you're most welcome to our discussion this evening, and we're glad to actually have you.
Thank you. It's really an honor. Thank you very much, Andrew, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you. All right. So to our guests that are, to our attendees that are here, please feel free to ask your questions because trust me, we're going to have a very engaging discussion this evening and on this very important topic. We are actually very excited to have you. Again, we do not have Anoba Babatunde Ibrahim, who is the managing editor at African Liberty. He's also quite engaged and he was unable to actually join us this evening. Okay, so having introduced our topic this evening and our guest, I have a couple of questions that I'm going to be asking our guest related to trade policy in conflict zone areas and the steps to recovery. But Professor, I want you first of all to give us, or would you kindly provide an overview of the unique challenges and opportunities that trade policy faces, especially in conflict zone areas? Maybe you'd want to dive into that one first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I think it's clear to anyone who engages with the news, even if at a sort of cursory level, that the world is once again experiencing a growth in the frequency and magnitude of interstate conflicts, right? Due to a number of reasons. As you mentioned, I work in territorial disputes, and we're seeing that reason being really the most dominant. And, these territorial disputes were sort of lulled or quieted down for one reason or another in the past, let's say, 3 decades, but they've become reactivated again in many regions. And sort of the most attention-grabbing cases are Russia and Ukraine and Palestine and Israel. And Azerbaijan, including Guyana and Venezuela, which, although they've not yet reached a state of outright conflict, it is a growing dispute. There's also closer to home, right? Ethiopia and Somalia. You can look at that in 2 ways. Dispute over the Ogaden with the sort of secessionist element within Ethiopia, but also the Somaliland issue that Ethiopia has played into. There's a long history of that conflict and what Ethiopia did, in fact, to collapse the central state in Somalia during the Derg. Also linked to that, or increasingly linked to that now, but previously a separate issue is Ethiopia and Egypt, right? Dispute over waters of the Nile. Things are also not too good on the Sudan-Ethiopia border and Western Sahara and Morocco. And these are just some of the conflicts, right, on an interstate level. Then within states, in terms of civil wars, there are growing, there's civil wars, there's growing insurgencies. So you can think of, again, secessionist elements in Ethiopia. Almost every region in that country has secessionist desires, from Oromia to Amhara, and so on. Terrorism is rampant in Somalia, in Nigeria. And then there's sort of complex conflicts that involved rebel militias. And here we can look at the DRC or some combination of really all of the above in the case of Libya. And so when it comes to trade, what does this all mean for trade policy? Well, conflicts make it difficult for normal economics, quote unquote, normal economics. But I think we all know what that means, right? The absence of peace means that normal economics of demand and supply is eliminated, right? It cannot play out for various reasons, right? People can't, people are in refugee situations, people are displaced, people cannot set up businesses, cannot acquire goods and services as and when they need and can afford. And so conflicts then lead to an aversion when it comes to foreign investment, because investor appetite diminishes. Who would invest their funds in a conflict-riddled situation? Somebody who has an appetite for risk, hoping for a long-term investment, but most investors are not able to do so. It also reduces sectors like tourism. It also interrupts social spending, which has a long-term significance when we get to the post-conflict recovery stage. It also destroys trade flows, sometimes quite literally. We've seen this in the case of Western Sahara in Morocco, Western Sahara's independence fighters going after trade infrastructure of Morocco, right? Destabilizing, destroying, bombing the conveyor belt that links Morocco to sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a destruction of infrastructure there. And so trade is very sensitive in these times and in these areas because it is potentially a double-edged sword, by which I mean, how are we as the outside world to relate with these conflict-affected areas? And if you are the leader of a conflict-affected area, you need to regain the trust of the outside world. You need to ensure the sympathy of the outside world. And it therefore comes into question what role you played in that conflict or are playing in that conflict. And so states, and by the way, also non-state actors, right? So states and non-state actors may use trade to recover and lead to a genuinely new era of prosperity, post-conflict reconstruction, rebuilding, or they may use it to mobilize resources to renew those war efforts, right? And so the international community is always skeptical not to be contributing to the escalation or renewal of conflicts. On the other hand, then you risk being too punitive, right? In other words, when you maintain trade restrictions and sanctions on these areas, on these countries, you increase, ironically or paradoxically, the prospect of a relapse into conflict. And so these are some of the unique challenges that come with trade policy for the players themselves and for all of the outside world when it comes to engaging those conflict-affected societies. And when is a conflict really over? I think that's really at the core of this. And what to do then? Do we believe in a kind of restorative justice or in a kind of punitive process where we say we'll only trade with this country once the perpetrators of the conflict have been satisfactorily punished, right? And so also linked to this in terms of whether is a conflict over is a question of fair trade. And most exemplified here, I think, by the blood diamond phenomenon, right? We want to ensure that the products we are buying from these conflict-affected countries are ethically and legally produced throughout the value chain. But that is, of course, a very complicated process. And so these are some of the precarious balances that need to be borne in mind when we consider trade policy as it pertains to conflict-affected and post-conflict societies or zones or countries. And so post-conflict recovery support is one of those areas that I think present opportunity, but getting it right is key. And there needs alongside this to be political processes. That's why we don't think of politics and economics in isolation. We think of political economy to ensure that the conflict has indeed been diffused, or if it is not yet diffused, how to manage it and ensure that there is fair trade and ethical trade. So that's my kind of opener, Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for actually opening our minds with regards to that and giving us an overview of the challenges and, of course, the opportunities that come with trade, especially in the conflict zone areas. And so I see Patience, right? You have actually joined us. Thank you so much for coming on board. And we have started the conversation so far, and we're excited that you're able to join on behalf of Munyayiwashe. Is that right?
Munyayiwashe.
Munyayiwashe. My
Yes.
apologies for not pronouncing it correctly, but we are excited to actually have you. Okay, so just like I said, Professor was giving us an overview of the unique challenges and opportunities that policy faces when it comes to the conflict zones. Now, I want to find out maybe from you, Patience, about the specific trade policies that have proven to be the most effective in facilitating economic recovery. I know you are probably not from this sector, but for Munyayiwashe to actually recommend you, you probably have an idea. But we want to know what specific trade policies have proven to be the most effective in to facilitate economic recovery in conflict zone areas. Professor gave us quite a good examples of Ethiopia. I think he also mentioned of DRC, Sudan, and how can these countries actually benefit from trade policies that will help them facilitate the recovery of its economy.
So welcome. Thank you for having me. And as I said, I am filling in, but it's quite interesting. So in terms of what would be effective in policies in conflict zones, there is different things that tends to have an impact. So I'm looking at the different policies that we can find, like the SEZ, the Special Economic Zones. This is specific for targeted investments. And we have got the trade agreements, but that mainly focus on local industries. So they can help as well. And though with the special economic zones, with these, they're designated so that at least it offers incentives or something like tax breaks or streamlining regulations, just so you can attract the investment and then also stimulate economic activities. And these have proven successful in various contexts and can be adapted to suit the unique needs in African nations. And I think we can see a few that have come out much better when we look at those African countries that were in the middle of conflicts some years ago. But then now when we look at them, they have made improvements and they are doing actually better where the conflicts have ended. And so for this, I'm looking at, if I look at Rwanda, and the past conflict that has happened there. And then when I look at how it is now, I see a big difference and a big transformation. So there are some changes that we can get when we have these policies that are specific and target special places or specific places.
Thank you for actually bringing in those examples and the policies that you've mentioned there. And having given Rwanda as an example is brilliant, because I think Rwanda was one of the countries that had lots of conflict, and then we see the recovery of its economy, and everyone now is looking at Rwanda as a very good example. Professor, maybe you'd want to add on to some of the examples that she has actually alluded.
Thanks, Andrew. So I agree fully with the examples that have been given. I rather like the idea of a special economic zones, because that is targeted, and I think it gives incentive for sort of the rest of the country, depending on the context, to follow suit. And it's targeted, it's kind of surgical. And also, I think it's been largely the model of Ethiopia as well, quite interestingly. Of course, before 2020, but I think it's still to be regarded as key to that country's success. So I think when we think of policies meant to help post-conflict countries, the sort of golden standard is the Marshall Plan, which was introduced in Europe after the Second World War. Now, the journey of Europe in terms of recovering from that conflict is really kind of a miracle, and I think is a subject of substantial debate, especially among economic historians. But I think a few elements are clear from that case study. And one really important lesson is the need to, yes, gradually release the stranglehold of the state from the economy, but at the same time to ensure there is welfare support, because where does trade begin and end, really? I think, as has been touched on, trade is as much a domestic issue as it is an international issue. So by the time you ship goods abroad, a whole host of things have gone right for that to take place. And so because what you also want to avoid is growth without development, and for people to not identify with the recovery process that is happening, to be left behind. And so I think marrying this with some level of welfare support, because this is a society and a country that has recently gone through something quite destructive, I think that is necessary. So I think it used to be called embedded liberalism, the idea that you can have free trade or trade intensive policy, while at the same time providing support for the population. So I think another really underexplored case study is actually Namibia, right? Because that country went through a brutal 30-year conflict to gain independence from apartheid South Africa, and finally did so in the early 90s, and has enjoyed continuous growth since 1994. And there, 12% of Namibia's, if I'm correct, of Namibia's GDP comes from small and medium enterprises. And so that investment in entrepreneurship, that investment in diversification of the economy, because Namibia subsequently became a tourist attraction and a hospitality kind of mini superpower. And so I think that diversification as well, and broadening our understanding of what is trade policy is quite key. Then I would just add things like, for especially states that may still be undergoing conflict, but you don't want to close them off, because that would be effectively a blockade. I think certification processes to ensure really on a case-by-case basis that goods are making it to market not prejudicing entrepreneurs, businesses that may be playing along with the rules, right? Not exploiting the conflict situation for sort of cheap labor and other things. I think also preferential access arrangements for post-conflict countries is key, and that's kind of the lesson of the Marshall Plan, that preferential access to the US market for European countries, as well as I think import and export credits. I think they can be helpful. But I think above all, what Africa needs is access to markets, right? Without excessive preconditions, whether in peacetime, whether in post-conflict time. I think actually tariffs on African goods are still high, and non-tariff barriers to African goods in Europe and in the US are still quite high. And I think that's what's limiting Africa's access to those markets. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. Quite insightful there. And now I want us to talk a little bit about the government. Before I go there, for those that are joining us, welcome again to the monthly webinar for September. And today's topic is very important. We are looking at trade policy in conflict zone areas, steps of recovery. Now, how I want us to look at this in terms of the government, I want to see what is the balance, okay? I mean, how can the government balance the need of security with the promotion of free trade in conflict-affected areas? I see a lot of restrictions, I think, in some conflict zone areas or countries, and then the government would want to bring in their strict rules so that they say they are trying to, they're doing that because of the security of the country and so on. But then I want to start this question with you, Professor, in maybe a minute or two, and then I'll also give it to Patience. How can government balance the need of security with promotion of free trade in the conflict zone areas? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think balance is tricky. I think there's always going to be room for governments to broaden, because there are these WTO exceptions. I think Article 21 makes exceptions for kind of national interest or security interest exceptions, which then is used by governments to put in restrictions or to be excessively involved in terms of trade. So I think really the answer here is robust legislatures, right? Because governments will always want to accumulate power, the executive branch. But what I think can be of help is robust legislatures to hold the governments accountable, to have domestic legislation which, you know, comes into effect, that defines conditions under which you know, governments can put in these restrictions, kind of formula, right? In South Africa, there is one such in our constitution in terms of when are we in a state of defense, when are we in a state of emergency, and so on. So I think really the answer is robust legislation, because governments will always want to accumulate more power, and they take advantage of conflict situations actually to do that. So absent self-limiting governments, I think robust legislatures are key.
Thank you, Professor. All right, so how about you, Patience? How do you look at this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. When we look at the issue of balancing between security and free trade, we just need to remember that it is, we can to have free trade, to have free movement of goods and stuff around, even in conflict zones, is important. However, we shouldn't overlook the role of security in these areas as well. So like what Professor has said, in terms of we need robust border controls that help with the presence of peacekeeping forces. Those are essential. But then they also create a stable environment where the special economic zones, or whether it's small, medium enterprises, organizations can thrive in that area if they are comfortable that there is security and without fear of being exploited or being disrupted by war or by incidences. So security should not stifle trade, but it should support it. And it should, that when we have good security, then it provide the confidence and the stability that the businesses would need, and that would also attract investors so that they can come with the confidence that they will be secure, that their products will reach the intended markets, and that if their employees or those who will be delivering or on the ground will be secure. Then if they are guaranteed of that, then they will definitely do that. And it's also we in that if we have that confidence in the security, then obviously you will attract foreign direct investments, and we need that to rebuild the economies of these zones. And it also helps in generating sustainable growth. So the important thing is whenever there's been a conflict, we need then that rebuilding the structures, the rebuilding the economy, rebuilding the trust, the confidence. But that cannot be done if investors are worried, they're not confident of how secure the area is. So in essence, security and free trade, they are two sides of the same coins. So you can't dismiss the other. They reinforce each other, and they create kind of like a virtuous cycle that allows the growth and stability. And if the areas with this who are emerging out of conflict, if they ensure the security and then promote open markets, then in that way they lay the foundations for lasting peace and prosperity and also sustainable growth.
Thank you so much, Patience. I mean, that's also very insightful. You two having brought in the aspect of security and also investment, attracting investment into the zones is also one important aspect, and also limited government there. Okay, now, for those that are joining us again, please feel free to actually raise your hand if at all you want to ask a question. Professor and Patience are here to actually answer your question. So if you want to ask a question, you can just raise your hand, or you can type in the Q&A, and then I'll be able to answer. Okay, I see someone has just raised their hand. Let me just give them access to speak, and then we can, let me just check. Okay, I saw someone raise their hand, but I can't see them anymore. Okay, so we will proceed, but you can also type your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll be able to answer them from there. Now, Professor, let's talk about the media a little bit, because I think we have the media in these conflict zone areas. But what do you think is the role of the media in highlighting the success stories of trade-led recovery conflict zones, and how can this actually influence policy making? We've seen the BBC, we've seen the Al Jazeera making stories out of conflict zone areas, and then, but then how do you feel those stories could actually influence policy making when it comes to free trade? Thank you.
So I think the media is a crucial player. But what we see is, and there's been many studies on this, is the media, I think maybe we're also to blame as society. The media tends to focus on negative stories because that's what actually generates views, right? That's what generates subscriptions and people tune in when there's something negative, which has also created really a vicious cycle when it comes to terrorism, because it turns out terrorists and journalists need each other quite a lot, but maybe that's another topic altogether. So in terms of success stories, it's quite tricky, because I do think on the one hand, the media does have a role to educate and to inform. And so the media must ask the relevant questions, right? Especially from policymakers. And they must be factual and statistical in their reporting and in their analysis. Because you don't want to be negative, but you also don't want to paint an unduly rosy picture, because whether from a business side or from the government side, there's an incentive to paint a rosy picture in terms of post-conflict recovery. And so media has a role to be objective, to educate and to inform. And that means, I think, asking the right questions, going on the ground, viewing and verifying information for their readers, for their viewers, and not being negative, but also not being unduly rosy. I think you can be rosy when there's genuine success stories to report, but it's always tricky. It's always tricky when it comes to the media, because you don't want to sort of play into the official narrative, how far we've come, things are good now, everyone is, the economy is fine again, and so on. But you also don't want to be negative. So I think media must be must be factual and objective in their reporting. Thank you.
Yeah, which is actually very true. And thank you so much. Patience, do you want to add something with regards to the role of the media in reporting such stories in conflict zone areas?
Certainly. Thanks, Andrew. So as we may be aware, when there is a conflict, there is limited access, there is all that's happening. And the media is the instrument that brings us the information, and I should say most time it's underestimated, but actually the media has got the power to shape the narratives, and they've got the power to influence public opinion, depending on what they narrate. And then they've also got the power to attract international attention. So one of the most powerful, impactful way that media can help in these zones is by humanizing economic recovery. Instead of focusing on statistics, policies, and all that, they can showcase some real life cases. So, or success stories, whether it be of the small medium enterprises, something that is happening, helping the recovery and all that. They can do that. And as you know, when there's conflict, we have challenges like infrastructure destruction, institutional weaknesses, security concerns, limited access to information, trauma, and social cohesion. All these are things that have an impact in a place, community, and all that. So then the media can now come in and play a role in helping to rebuild the social cohesion through inclusive reporting. So like what Professor was saying, that depending on how or who give them the narrative. So sometimes we then get biased media reports or that, but then if used correctly, it can help to rebuild. It can also help to promote economic revitalization through business coverages. So we can have media reports telling us, like I'll give again the example of Rwanda there. If the media was to report it correctly, they would then say, this was the area during conflict, and this is what it is now. It's bustling, it's full of this, and inviting further SMEs. And I know I've got a few colleagues that are now doing farming. So I've seen a few Zimbabwean guys who are now farming in Rwanda. And they are producing their stuff, they're doing businesses. And I also know someone who is also gone out there and they're making bags. And they've gone into that market and they have a success story. So media can help in that. They can also support peace building through conflict-sensitive reporting. So what Professor was alluding, so if the media is reporting correctly, and it's not just about giving the direct facts and just throwing them out, no, but it's being sensitive. Why is it important to be sensitive? Because there are times when you need to ensure whatever you do or whatever the media does portray is quite sensitive in terms of its impact to the viewers or its impact to the people who might be related to something that would be posted there. So there is need for that. And they can also, media can help in terms of enhancing transparency and accountability in governance or in organizations in the countries post-conflict. Then at least that helps then to encourage investors. Then if we're seeing the correct reports, which is very transparent, which shows what is happening, then it promotes, it encourages investment. So the media can play that crucial role, and it can also help in facilitating dialogue and reconciliation between the organizations that would have been in conflict. So media plays a very important role, not to be underestimated. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I just love the flow of this discussion. I see there is a question right now from, let me just check in the chat. I see there's a question from Beluman, Beliamino. So he says there are certain countries where the government has not given free access to the market in terms of free trade and so on. And so he has a question now. He says, what should the residents do for the government to allow free access to the market within the conflict zone areas? That's a very important question. I think he wanted you, Professor, to actually answer this question.
Okay, I think we can all tackle it together. So, of course, every conflict is unique, right? It is created by set of circumstances particular to a country or a region. So I would maybe be careful also to say what should the residents do, right? Because that kind of shifts the responsibility to ordinary people. And we all know that conflict is kind of an elite political entrepreneurship exercise. It's people who have the power to go against, to fight against their government or to, perpetuate other kinds of conflict. And so the ordinary person is often caught in between in a conflict situation. Government mistrusts you from a particular region. On the other hand, the warring parties or the conflicting parties from that region may also, expect citizens of the region to join their militias or their whatever you want to call them. Otherwise, they're considered to be spies or whatever label you want to use. We've seen this time and time again. You can go to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, wherever. And so I wouldn't put so much responsibility on what the citizens have to do to get access, other than, of course, advocate and organize in any ordinary political sense. And that does mean, making use of whatever laws are available to you and mobilizing as a sector. Really, I think the only obligation I would put on ordinary businesses, ordinary citizens, is the obligation of not contributing to the conflict, right? So if you're saying you want access to the free market, be able to ship your goods, that must mean, of course, you are not also, participating in some way in the conflict, making things worse. You're not a front for one of the conflicting parties where the proceeds go to the purchasing of weapons and the like. But I think beyond that, I don't see any obligation on the ordinary citizen. I think it's the government's role to ensure that because citizens have rights, right? And one of those rights enshrined in many constitutions is the right to trade, is the right to participate in the labor force and so on. So that's how I would approach that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And so I actually wasn't quite biased because I'm so excited that there's another question for you, Patience, in the chat. And this is very interesting. So Ernest says, how can you explain the business people could have trade policy in conflict zone areas in case of many African countries refuse to ratify the protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Area signed in Kigali, Rwanda in 2018? I don't know whether you understand this question. Do you?
Thanks, Andrew. I think I will answer it in the way that I think I'm understanding it. So if I don't answer it, you can further ask. But so the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement was signed in Rwanda in 2018, and not many countries signed to it. And they were a bit hesitant to ratify it. But so my understanding is you are wanting to know that how then can businesses thrive in that. So my answer is, if for business organizations, they would need to adapt to the local realities. So you don't need to be naive. You need to adapt and adjust to the given area, understand what the local market dynamics are and what the consumer needs are and how things are flowing. And then you fit in your businesses. So businesses can still thrive in conflict zones, but they do need to do their research on the ground fully. Otherwise, they might end up putting themselves at risk of conflict or security and that. And then also building relationships with local stakeholders and authorities. So it might be political, it might be, there be a lot of powers that be, depending on what the conflict is or what the source of the conflict is and what it is about. And then developing flexible business models that will allow you to navigate any uncertainties. So if you were going this way, suppose we were taking this route, and unfortunately that road is blocked or there's security issues on that side, then be flexible, have business ideas or projects that can adapt and adjust, because this is in conflict zones or post-conflict. So there might still be obstacles along the way. So you need to have that. And I think in brief, that can that should hopefully answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for also having introduced the African Continental Free Trade Area in this question, and you answered it very correctly. Yeah, if anyone else wants to ask their question, please, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the Q&A, and then we will be able to answer your question from there. I have a few questions, or let me see from our side if we can ask one more question and then get to the audience. Right, before I go to the questions, I see one person has actually raised their hand. That is Henry. So Henry, you can go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Good evening to our panelists and Mr. Moderator, and thank you so much for such an illuminating debate. I have two questions. My first question is, as civil society organizations, as think tanks, as NGOs, how can we best adapt our work to deliver the most impact in these conflict regions, if we're not there physically? And my second question is, in regards to cooperation, what role should we collectively play, especially in Africa, in order to ensure a much more consistent approach in dealing with conflicts? for example, Cameroon and Nigeria now cooperate on the land border to address the Boko Haram crisis. And so are there other examples across the continent that are happening? And if not, what can we do collectively to achieve that? Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for that question. We can start with Professor, and then Patience, you will go next.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Henry. And let me also say thank you for your work in civil society in terms of also this working in these conflict zones, which of course is very dangerous and commendable work. So I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because I think safety is paramount, but I think what Patience mentioned earlier in terms of humanizing the people that are affected by these conflicts, I think is key. And adapting to these conflict areas, I think social media and various other technologies have become useful in a sense because you are able to communicate information in a, I think, faster and perhaps even safer way, especially when we consider things like making use of virtual private networks to ensure that the good work that you're doing also does not unnecessarily or unduly expose one to risks that come with these conflicts. But of course, each conflict is unique, and you always in civil society, in humanitarian work, in civil society work, have to navigate, on the one hand, gaining access to the conflict areas, maintaining your own security. And we've seen, I mean, some really devastating stuff out of the conflict in Palestine, where, civil society, infrastructure, civil society vehicles are targeted for bombing. And I think that sets a very dangerous precedent. I think because Israel seems to have gotten away with it, I think other leaders in conflicts, other governments or other actors in conflicts are going to, I think, push the boundaries there as well. So, on the main, I would say there's a need to strengthen or to renew international law, and especially international law of conflict when it comes to humanitarian workers of various sorts. So my answer is not very helpful, but I would say there's both a need for bottom-up and top-down solutions, ensuring that also you're making adequate use of technology that is coming out, not just social media, but all forms of AI that is coming out. And then at the same time, advocating, ensuring that there is once again respect for international humanitarian law. So I'll end there, Henry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Patience, do you want to also answer the question? Okay, perfect. All right, so
Okay.
thanks, Henry.
Sorry, I was locked out of my technology. I couldn't undo my microphone. But I would just add on to say, yes, it might not be the straight answer because, yeah, but what is paramount in terms of your question, Henry, I would just add on to what Professor has said. So in it all, the adapting to surviving in conflict zones, it requires resilience and being flexible, and then also to be resourceful to what is available, utilizing all sources of information, knowledge, and stuff. So physical safety, staying informed about the conflict dynamics and security threats, that is crucial, because otherwise, if you drop yourself in the middle of it, then it doesn't work. Avoiding areas of conflict or military operations is paramount. Use of safe shelters or evacuation routes is also quite important. But what might be overlooked as well is make sure you have enough emergency supplies food, water, first aid, not just for you, but also for those around you that that might need it. And then there is that need to adapt economically. So depending on what is happening, what you're doing within there, diversify the income sources. Informal trade, whatever is around, use of alternative currencies or bartering systems, just adding to. So you need to be an all-rounder in order for you to pull through. But I know some time ago when Zimbabwe was in conflict, the conflict in Zimbabwe wouldn't have been successful without the social support. The freedom fighters, and as they were working around, and the different groups that were fighting, they made it through because they had strong community networks and relationships, to a point that they would be walking, if they were walking in an area, and then suddenly the military zone changes and it's there. Do you know, they were hidden by the community. They survived. There's a lot of survival stories because they were hidden. And I know one that I used to laugh at. I had a keen interest from the time I was growing. But people, one fighter was walking. As we was walking, suddenly realized message was communicated by there was no phones, there was no WhatsApp, there was no this, but information was relayed and fast. And this was relayed, and the guy found himself stuck. And guess what? He managed. The people around him were very crafty and quick. They managed to wrap around a dress that made him look like a woman, carried a baby behind, had some stuff that made him a woman with the breasts, everything. And he was covered. I don't know where they laid his guns and stuff, but they were all hidden and quickly out of sight. And the guy walked, and he walked out. So, but it was because there was a good community network, and the people had, the fighters had very good relationships, and that helps. So I'm hoping you can take something from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patience, for that insightful answer. I know there's one more question I want to ask, and this one is very important. I didn't want this webinar to end without asking this question. And I will start with you, Patience, in 1 minute, and then I'll also go to Professor in 1 minute. How does the principle of limited government play a role in terms of classical liberalism? Okay, how do these play the role of management of trade policies to post-conflict recovery? We're talking about limited government here, and how does it really play a role in managing trade policies in post-conflict recovery? In 1 minute, Patience.
In 1 minute, I will say the key is to strike the right balance between providing essential public goods and fostering an enabling environment for private sector-led recovery. By doing that, we can harness the power of the markets to drive growth, and growth that is sustainable, and also to create lasting prosperity in the aftermath of a conflict. I hope I made it in 30 seconds.
Interesting. Okay, Professor, as well, in 1 minute. Thank you.
I think Patience has set a record for the most effective answer in the shortest amount of time possible. Well, I would simply just add that, you know, each conflict is unique, and I do believe in limited government, but I think we mustn't be in a hurry. So I think, as Patience has said, we must strike the right balance so that we can achieve private sector-led recovery, which I think is also a symptom that the conflict is indeed over. So I think when the entrepreneur or business owners can flourish, then that tells us that that the conflict is over. And so I would say that you know, a gradual approach so that you don't also risk relapsing to a conflict situation. But yes, I think the goal here should be, because that is a sign when the government can be able to pull back and release some of these functions. That's how Europe, for example, recovered. If you look at case studies such as West Germany, where the government did introduce some reforms after the conflict. And also, the European economy as a whole really took off once governments had let go of some of the functions that they used to have, including price controls, currency controls, and so on. But that must be merited, maybe going back to my initial earlier point, with support for ordinary citizens, a combination of both limited government and welfare in the phase of transition, because here you're talking about people who have had their entire lives turned upside down. So marrying that support for the individual with the goal of obtaining a situation in which government can indeed let go of some of these wartime functions. So much longer than patience, but that's what I
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for those that have joined us, we were discussing about trade, free trade, and conflict zone areas, and we had experts in the field to make us understand. I think, Patience, you, by virtue of you being part of this panel, we are qualifying you to be an expert.
Thank you.
Even if you are standing on behalf of someone, but thank you so much for, sparing your time and just joining us in discussing this very important session. And to our attendees, thank you for spending your time as well to listen to us. My name is Andrew Munganga, and I'm the communications intern at African Liberty. Next month again, we are having quite an insightful session. So just be on the lookout via email, and then you will get notified. You'll be notified with the next topic for the next webinar next month. Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed weekend. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Blessed weekend.